The wildest part of this story is not that my neighborhood association trapped me inside my own house for almost 2 months. It is not even that I lost a job that would have changed my entire life because of it. The wildest part is that the person who finally made them regret every smug little email they ever sent me was a 70-year-old woman who lived 2 doors down and baked lemon bread on Sundays. My name is Nolan Reed. I'm 41 years old. And at the time this happened, I lived in a quiet, planned community called Maple Creek Reserve, just outside Fort Collins, Colorado. The kind of neighborhood where every lawn looked like it had been measured with a ruler, and every mailbox had the exact same shade of black paint, which should have been my first warning, honestly, because any time a place cares that much about mailbox paint, there is probably somebody nearby losing their mind over a trash can being visible for 11 minutes too long. I work in roadway design. Mostly drainage plans, curb layouts, accessible routes, the boring stuff nobody thinks about until it ruins their day. And because of a spinal injury from a worksite accident years earlier, I use a wheelchair. So access is not an abstract concept to me. It is not a line on a blueprint or a code requirement buried in some manual. It is the difference between leaving my house like a normal person and staring at my van like it is parked on the moon. For the most part, I kept to myself, paid my dues, waved at neighbors, trimmed the shrubs when the HOA sent one of those passive-aggressive reminders, and tried not to get involved in community politics, because there is nothing on earth more exhausting than adults arguing over whether beige is too adventurous for exterior siding. But trouble has a funny way of finding the quiet people, especially when the loud people mistake quiet for weak. It started on a Thursday evening in late September. I had just gotten home from a final prep meeting with a recruiter, and I was in a good mood. The kind of good mood you do not want to admit out loud because you are afraid of scaring it away. I was interviewing for a senior transportation planning role with a private development firm in Denver, and the salary was $112,000 a year, plus bonuses, plus remote flexibility after the first 90 days, which for me was not just a raise, it was breathing room. It was medical bills, without panic. It was replacing the old ramp van that made a noise like a washing machine full of rocks every time I turned left. I rolled up to my front walkway expecting the usual, maybe a package on the porch, maybe my neighbor Dale pretending he was not spying from behind his blinds, and instead I found 2 orange barriers, a stack of pressure-treated lumber, 3 mounds of gravel, torn-up concrete chunks, and the rented mini excavator parked directly across the only accessible path between my front door and my driveway. At first I laughed, because the human brain sometimes chooses comedy before it chooses rage. I thought, okay, somebody made a mistake. A crew blocked the wrong section. They will be back in the morning. I will call. This will be annoying but temporary. Then I looked closer and saw a laminated sign zip tied to the barrier. Maple Creek Reserve Drainage, Beautification Project. Estimated duration 6 to 7 weeks. Please avoid work zones. Please avoid work zones. That was the first time I felt something cold move through my chest. Because I was not avoiding a work zone, I was trapped behind one. There was no temporary mat, no alternate route, no plywood bridge, no portable ramp, not even a half-hearted apology taped to my door. My van was maybe 25 feet away, sitting there in the driveway with its side lift folded up, perfectly useless. I could see the driver's side window catching the sunset. I could see the parking permit hanging from the mirror. I could even see the little coffee stain on the console from the morning, and somehow it felt farther away than Denver. I called the HOA management office before they closed. A woman named Marla Crane answered, and I knew Marla by voice because she had once left me a voicemail about a garden hose being visible from the street, and she had managed to make garden hose sound like a felony. I explained what had happened, calmly at first, because you always think calm will help reasonable people become reasonable. I told her the construction materials were blocking my only wheelchair-accessible route to my vehicle. She gave this tiny little sigh. Not a big, dramatic sigh, just enough to tell me my existence had become an inconvenience on her calendar. She said, "Mr. Reed, that area is part of an approved association improvement project." I said, "Marla, approved by who?" Because whoever approved it forgot the part where I need to leave my house. She paused, like she was deciding whether that was worth writing down, then said the project was temporary and expected to take 6 to 7 weeks. I remember gripping the wheel of my chair and staring at that stupid laminated sign while she spoke, because there is something surreal about hearing someone describe your loss of basic access as temporary, Like 6 or 7 weeks is just a long weekend with better branding. I told her I had an in-person interview Monday morning. I told her this was not a preference issue, not a complaint about noise or dust, but an actual access problem. She said, and I will never forget the flatness in her voice, "The board cannot redesign community projects around individual lifestyle concerns." Lifestyle concerns. A phrase hit me so hard, I almost laughed again. But not the good kind of laugh, the kind that comes out when your brain is trying not to break something. I said, "Marla, my wheelchair is not a lifestyle." She went quiet for a second, then said she would note my objection for the next board review. I asked when that was. She said 3 weeks. Then, before I could even respond, she added, "You are welcome to submit a written request, but emotional urgency does not override approved timelines." Emotional urgency. That was the moment the story changed. Up until then, I thought I was dealing with bad planning. After that sentence, I understood I was dealing with people who had already decided I did not count. The weekend that came and went. No crew showed up. No one moved a single board. I emailed photos, then more photos, then a diagram. Because I'm an engineer and apparently my first instinct under stress is to make exhibits like I am preparing for trial in my kitchen. Monday morning, I put on the shirt I had planned to wear to the interview anyway, which was probably a little pathetic, but I needed to feel like the opportunity was still real. I called a recruiter and explained the situation, and to her credit, she was kind. She sounded horrified, actually. They moved the interview to Friday. I thanked her about 6 times, hung up, and sat there in my doorway looking at the excavator bucket resting on my walkway like some lazy metal animal that had decided to sleep across my future. By Wednesday, I had called the HOA 4 more times. By Thursday, I'd emailed the board directly. By Friday morning, nothing had changed, and the firm could not keep delaying the process. They interviewed the other candidate in person. A week later, I got the call. "You were an excellent finalist, Noland," the hiring manager said, and I could tell she meant it, which somehow made it worse. We just had to move forward with someone who could meet the on-site schedule. I said I understood because what else are you supposed to say when your life gets rerouted by gravel and arrogance? After I hung up, I sat in the kitchen for a long time with my phone face down on the table. I was not crying, not exactly, but my eyes kept doing this annoying thing where they filled up without permission. It was not just the money. People always think it is just the money. It was the years behind it. The late nights, the certifications, the rehab after my injury, the way I had clawed my career back inch by inch, and then some people in polo shirts and name tags erased it with a project schedule they could not be bothered to adjust. The funny thing is, the HOA president, Grant Weller, had never liked me much even before this. Grant was one of those men who treated community authority like elected office, except nobody remembered electing him and the stakes were usually mulch. A year earlier, I had questioned a drainage assessment at an annual meeting because the numbers did not make sense, and I said so politely, maybe too politely, because nothing irritates a small tyrant like being corrected by someone who knows the subject. Grant smiled through it, but his ears went red, and after that, every small violation notice seemed to find my mailbox first. I did not think he was targeting me then. I told myself adults do not behave that way. That is one of the more embarrassing lies I believed before this whole thing happened. About 3 weeks into the blockage, I was on my porch around dusk, because when you cannot go anywhere, the porch becomes your whole stupid universe. I was watching a couple of kids ride bikes past the barriers when one of them slowed down and asked, "Mister, why is your sidewalk broken?" Before I could answer, his mother tugged him along like my situation might be contagious. That one hurt more than I expected. A few minutes later, I heard a soft voice from the sidewalk. "Nolan, how long has that mess been there?" I looked over and saw Vivian Hart, my neighbor from 2 doors down, standing with a canvas grocery bag in one hand and a cane in the other. Vivian was retired, sharp as broken glass, and always dressed like she might be invited to testify before Congress at any moment. Most people knew her as the lady with the roses. I knew something else. Before she retired, Vivian Hart had been a federal magistrate judge, and judging by the way she was looking at those orange barriers, Maple Creek Reserve had just made the worst possible person curious. Vivian did not raise her voice. She did not gasp. She did not do the thing people do when they want you to know they are being compassionate. She just stood there for a few seconds, studying the gravel piles, the lumber, the torn concrete, the mini excavator. Then she looked back at me and said, "Nolan, tell me exactly what happened." And I mean exactly. So I did. I told her about the Thursday evening, the laminated sign, the first call with Marla Crane, the 6 to 7 week timeline, the phrase lifestyle concerns, the delayed interview, the missed interview, the final phone call from the hiring manager, all of it. And the whole time, Vivian stood there with one hand on her cane and the other, gripping that canvas grocery bag like she had forgotten she was holding it. When I got to the part about emotional urgency not overriding approved timelines, she made a tiny sound through her nose. Not a laugh exactly, more like a judge hearing a bad argument from a lawyer who should know better. Then she asked one question. "Do you have records?" I almost smiled for the first time in weeks. "Vivian," I said, "I have records of records." She came inside, and I brought out everything. Emails, screenshots, call logs, dated photos, the project notice, my own access diagrams, the recruitment emails, the rescheduling messages, the final rejection, even the original site plan from when my house had been modified after my injury. I remember feeling embarrassed as I spread it all over the dining table, like maybe I had become one of those people who turns personal misery into paperwork. But Vivian looked at the folders like they were ammunition. She took off her glasses, cleaned them with a napkin, put them back on, and said, "Nolan, this is not you being difficult. This is them being careless, and maybe worse than careless. That maybe worse part sat in the air longer than I liked." She asked if she could take copies. I said yes. She asked if I'd sent a written accommodation request. I said I had not used those exact words, because honestly I had assumed telling them I could not leave my house would be clear enough. She nodded slowly and said, "Clarity is what decent people need. Nolan, paper trails are what the other kinds need." The next morning at 7:42, Vivian knocked on my door with a legal pad, a thermos of coffee, and a lemon bread wrapped in foil, because apparently some people prepare for war like they are hosting brunch. She had already reviewed the documents, checked county records, searched the association's posted minutes, and found something strange. The so-called drainage beautification project had first appeared in a meeting packet only 3 weeks before construction started, which was fast for Maple Creek, because this was an HOA that once debated shrub replacement for 4 months like it was a hostage negotiation. The project was labeled as erosion prevention around the West Common Strip, but the actual work zone began right near my property and bent around the sidewalk toward the homes on Grant Weller's side of the cul-de-sac. Vivian tapped the map with her pen and said, "Why would a community erosion project start by blocking your only accessible route and then run downhill toward Grant's lot?" I told her I did not know. She said, "I think Mr. Weller knows." By noon, she'd helped me draft a formal demand letter, firm but clean, not emotional, not dramatic, just facts, dates, consequences, requested remedy, temporary accessible route within 24 hours, removal of obstructions from my access path, preservation of communications, and notice that failure to act would trigger legal complaints. Vivian insisted on that last part. "People get very honest," she said, when they realized deleting emails might become its own problem. We sent it to Marla, the board, and the association's general counsel. For 5 hours, nothing happened. Then Marla replied with a paragraph that somehow managed to be both cold and stupid, which is a dangerous combination in writing. She said the board sympathized with my frustration but could not halt an approved community improvement due to one resident's transportation preferences. Transportation preferences. I read that phrase twice, then handed the phone to Vivian. She looked at it, blinked once, and said, "Well, that was generous of her." I asked what she meant. Vivian said, "She gave us the tone in writing." That evening, the board held its monthly meeting in the clubhouse, and since I could not physically get there, Dale from across the street offered to FaceTime me from the back row. Dale was a retired mail carrier with the gossip instincts of a courtroom sketch artist, and I'd never appreciated him more. The video was shaky. Half the time I was staring at his thumb, but I could hear Grant Weller clearly. He was up front in his navy blazer. The one he wore any time he wanted people to forget this was a volunteer board and not the United Nations. Someone asked about the blocked walkway. Grant gave this patient little smile and said, "We cannot allow every resident to derail infrastructure work by personalizing inconvenience." Vivian, sitting beside me at my kitchen table, leaned toward the phone and whispered, "Oh, he is going to hate reading that transcript." Then Marla said they had offered me the option to submit concerns in writing, which was technically true in the same way a locked door technically offers you the option to knock. A woman named Paula Brooks, who lived on the corner, asked whether I had any way to leave home safely. There was a pause. Grant said, "We are not medical transport coordinators." That was the moment Vivian stopped taking notes and looked up. It was not anger on her face. Not exactly. It was recognition. Like she had finally placed the kind of person she was dealing with. The next 48 hours moved faster than the previous month. Vivian called an attorney she trusted, a civil rights litigator named Samir Patel, who agreed to take a look. Samir was younger than I expected, cheerful in a dangerous way, the kind of guy who smiled while explaining why someone else had made a terrible mistake. He came to my house because, again, I could not leave it, and after reviewing the records, he said, "I am going to say this gently, but your HOA appears to have stepped into a bad trap and then emailed everyone that they meant to do it." He filed an emergency request in county court, seeking immediate restoration of access and preservation of records, and he also sent notices to the city accessibility office and the county building department, because Vivian's permit research had raised enough questions to make this bigger than me. That part made me nervous. I had wanted my path cleared. I had not planned to become the fuse on a neighborhood bomb. But Vivian told me something I still think about. She said, "Nolan, when people misuse small power, they count on the injured person asking only for enough relief to stop hurting. That is how patterns survive." The first hearing was set for the following Tuesday. On Monday afternoon, Marla called me directly for the first time since her written response. Her voice had changed. Not kind exactly, but polished. Like somebody had reminded her phones can become evidence. She said, "Mr. Reed, the board is willing to explore temporary solutions if you are willing to withdraw your emergency filing." I looked at Vivian, who was sitting across from me peeling an orange with the calm of a woman watching a trap close. I told Marla any proposal needed to go through my attorney. Marla exhaled and said, "I really wish you had been more cooperative from the beginning. I do not know what came over me. Maybe exhaustion, maybe the ghost of that lost job." But I said, "Marla, I was cooperative when I asked to leave my house. You were just more comfortable when I was trapped in it." She did not answer. She hung up. The next morning, Samir arranged transport through a medical service, which the HOA later tried to act like I should have been using all along, as though paying hundreds of dollars to attend a hearing about their obstruction was a normal neighborhood amenity. When we arrived at the courthouse, Grant was already there with 2 board members and a lawyer who looked far too relaxed for someone whose client had put transportation preferences in writing. Grant saw me, then saw Vivian beside me, and his smile faltered for half a second. Vivian gave him a polite nod, the kind you give a man standing on thin ice. Inside, the hearing started quietly. Their attorney argued the project was temporary, necessary, approved, and not directed at me personally. Samir did not start with outrage. He started with photos, then dates, then emails, then the recruitment timeline, then the board meeting quote. "We are not medical transport coordinators." I watched Grant shift in his seat when that line was read aloud. It sounded different in a courtroom, stripped of clubhouse confidence. Then Samir introduced the permit packet Vivian had found. The judge looked down at it for a long moment and asked the HOA attorney whether the approved project scope matched the actual construction footprint. The attorney said he would need to verify. The judge asked who authorized the expanded work. The attorney looked back at Grant. Grant looked at Marla. Marla looked at the table. And for the first time since this whole nightmare started, nobody from Maple Creek had a ready sentence. Then the judge ordered the access route cleared immediately. But he did not stop there. He directed the county to review the project scope, permits, drainage impacts, and related board approvals. Grant's face went pale in this slow, satisfying way, like the color was leaving in sections. I thought that was the victory. I really did. I thought we had won the thing we came for. But as Vivian leaned close and whispered, "This is where they find out what they actually built," I realized the hearing had not ended the fight. It had opened a door, and behind that door was something the HOA had been praying nobody would notice. At first, the neighborhood treated the county review like background noise, one more boring administrative thing that would pass through Maple Creek and disappear. But then the inspectors showed up with clipboards, survey flags, and the kind of calm expressions that make guilty people suddenly remember dentist appointments. They started at the common drainage strip near my house, then moved toward the cul-de-sac, then toward the retaining wall behind Grant Weller's property, and by the second week, little orange correction notices were appearing around the neighborhood like Halloween decorations nobody wanted. The first report said the construction footprint did not match the approved plan. The second said certain drainage changes had been performed without proper review. The third mentioned runoff redirection toward private lots, which was a polite government way of saying someone had changed how water moved through the neighborhood and hoped gravity would keep quiet. Samir called me after that one and said, "Nolan, this is no longer just an access case." Vivian, who was in my kitchen again because by then my kitchen had become the unofficial war room, simply nodded and said, "It never was." The strangest part was watching the board's confidence rot in public. Grant stopped giving long speeches at meetings. Marla stopped using phrases like lifestyle concerns. The board emails became careful, sterile, full of words like review, cooperation, and unforeseen, which was hilarious because nothing about this was unforeseen to me. I had foreseen it from my front door every single morning. Meanwhile, the walkway that had supposedly required 6 or 7 weeks of patience was cleared in one afternoon. One afternoon, a crew came with 2 trucks, moved the lumber, leveled the gravel, laid a temporary accessible mat, and installed proper barriers with enough room for my chair to pass safely. I sat on the porch while they worked, and I should have felt relieved, but mostly I felt insulted because the speed proved what I had already suspected. They could have fixed the immediate problem any time they wanted. They just needed the right kind of fear. A few days later, Dal came over with a grocery bag full of muffins his wife had made, and he leaned close like he was delivering classified information. He said, "You're not going to believe this." But I absolutely believed it, because at that point, Maple Creek had become a soap opera with irrigation rules. According to Dale, inspectors had found that Grant's backyard expansion, the one he called a garden equipment garage, even though it looked big enough to house a small helicopter, extended into a protected drainage easement. That was the moment the neighborhood lost its mind. This was the same man who had sent violation letters over bird feeders, basketball hoops, porch chairs, and once, I swear, a welcome mat that was too colorful. Now his own oversized garage was sitting where water was supposed to go. Vivian heard the news, took one slow sip of coffee, and said, "Selective enforcement is a terrible hobby." The next meeting was packed. People who had not attended an HOA meeting in 10 years showed up angry, curious, or just hungry for blood. I attended by video because even though my access was restored, I was still tired of giving that board the satisfaction of watching me struggle into their clubhouse. Paula Brooks stood first and asked why the board spent more money fighting me than it would have cost to build a temporary ramp on day one. Nobody answered. Then Dale asked whether Grant had voted on a project that benefited drainage near his own property. Grant said that was a mischaracterization. Vivian, sitting beside me on the video call, muttered, "That means yes, but with better shoes." Then Marla tried to calm the room by saying the board had acted in good faith based on available information. I leaned toward my laptop and said, "Marla, I was available information. My emails were available information. The photos were available information. The fact that I could not leave my house was available information." The room went quiet in that way. Rooms go quiet when people realize the simple version is the worst version. After that, everything came apart quickly. The association's insurer reserved rights on certain claims, which meant they were not promising to pay for every bad decision the board had made. Legal fees climbed. Engineering consultants were hired. Corrective work was ordered. The reserve fund that had once been discussed like sacred treasure started shrinking like ice on a hot sidewalk. Homeowners received a notice about possible special assessments, and suddenly people who had ignored my situation for weeks were very interested in accessibility, permits, drainage, and accountability. I would love to say that did not bother me, but it did. Some neighbors had passed my block path every day and said nothing until their wallets felt threatened. That is an oddly thing to notice about a community, but it is also human, I guess. Pain becomes real to some people only when it sends them an invoice. Eventually, Grant resigned. He called it stepping back to protect his family from negativity, which was a generous phrase for getting caught with an illegal garage and a collapsing board record. 2 other directors followed. Marla's management company was terminated 3 weeks later, and the new board ordered an independent audit of the project approvals. Samir negotiated a settlement for my lost opportunity, my costs, and the harm caused by the obstruction. I cannot discuss every number, but I can tell you this. The same people who once told me emotional urgency did not override timelines found out that legal urgency absolutely does. And the best part, the quietest part, was not the check or the resignations or even watching Grant avoid eye contact at the mailbox for the next 6 months. It was the first morning I rolled down that restored path without asking anyone, without arranging transport, without measuring whether my own neighborhood had left me enough dignity to get to my van. The air was cold, the kind of Colorado morning that makes your lungs wake up before the rest of you. And Vivian was in her front yard clipping roses. She looked over and raised her coffee cup. I raised mine back. No big speech, no movie music. Just two neighbors who understood that sometimes justice is not a lightning bolt. Sometimes it is a clear sidewalk after people spent months pretending a pile of gravel was policy. A few months later, I got another job offer. This one with a regional infrastructure firm that cared a lot more about remote work and a lot less about making people prove their worth by sitting in traffic. The salary was better than the Denver position, which felt almost too neat, like life was showing off. I still think about the job I lost, though. I think about the version of me who sat at the kitchen table in that interview shirt, trying not to fall apart. I think about how close I came to believing that if powerful people ignore you long enough, maybe you really are the problem. That is the part I want people to understand. The damage was never only the blocked path. It was being spoken to like my basic access was a personal inconvenience. It was watching people hide cruelty under procedure. It was learning that some systems do not become abusive because villains sit in dark rooms plotting evil. Sometimes they become abusive because ordinary people with tiny amounts of power decide admitting fault would feel too embarrassing. And once pride takes the wheel, common sense gets thrown in the trunk. Vivian told me later that the reason she stepped in was not just because I had helped her years before with the foundation issue at her house, though she remembered that, every hour of it. She said she stepped in because she had spent her whole career watching institutions test how much harm they could process. That stayed with me. Harm with letterhead is still harm. Discrimination with minutes emotions is still discrimination. And a blocked path does not become acceptable just because someone voted on it near a coffee urn. Today, Maple Creek Reserve looks peaceful again. The lawns are trimmed, the mailboxes are black, and the new board sends emails that sound like they were written by adults who have recently discovered consequences. My path is smooth, wide, and probably inspected more often than the clubhouse roof. Every now and then, someone asks if I think the consequences were too harsh. I always tell them the same thing. The consequences were not created by my complaint. They were created by every moment the board had a chance to fix the problem and chose arrogance instead. So here is what I want to know from you. If a neighborhood board, a company, or a local authority blocked someone's access, cost them a life-changing opportunity, and then treated them like they were just being dramatic, what would be fair in your mind? Would you have fought all the way, even after losing the job? Or would you have taken the first apology and tried to move on? And be honest, do you think the neighbors cared because it was wrong? Or because the fines finally reached their own front doors? Drop your thoughts in the comments, because stories like this always split people right down the middle. Some people think I went too far. Some people think I did not go far enough. But I know one thing for sure. The next time somebody in Maple Creek says rules are rules, they're going to remember that rules can protect people, or they can expose the people who are hiding behind them.